Okay, welcome to the third tutorial for the VCE English analyzing argument. Just to recap, this is going to be the third reading that we do to derive the evidence. If we just have a quick recap, the first reading we established the issue, the point of view, the sort of main contention and the audience for this particular media. And in the second reading, we went through and identified the key tone, the key arguments, and some of the audience, impact audience positioning kind of language that Mrs. Elliot was using. And now, based on those first two readings, you know, the next third reading is going to be to try and pick out those language points and the meta language which supports the arguments that we've identified. So let's carry on and do that right now. So if we recall, the first argument was that Mrs. Elliot is enthusiastic about ebooks, and there are some virtues or positive points about ebooks. So what we're going to do is just pick out the evidence which supports that argument. So we can begin by let's just highlight some of these things. Reading the future. Okay, fellow book lovers. Establishes the sort of inclusive nature of the speech and the forum. I have always been what's known as an early adopter, someone who is enthusiastic about new technology. As a teenager, I was excited about the massive change. I like change. I rushed out to buy. Easier to get, cheaper to own, more convenient to carry, had to be a good thing, free of the expense, effortless library borrowing, effortless return of books, without the terrible burden of great big textbooks. Okay, so what you can see here is that I'm just highlighting the key positive points or key virtues of ebooks or new technology. And so what we can find out here, if we just make some annotation here, that one is the inclusive statement here. I have always been. What we notice here is that Mrs. Elliot uses a lot of the first person. Using the first person makes it more personal and establishes her credibility or her reputation to be talking about the topic at hand. Okay, and then if we then pick out some of the key words: excited, early adopter, enthusiastic, rushed out to buy, a good thing. So here, you know, we're thinking about her enthusiasm for new technology. So that would be the first key point that we make, the enthusiasm for new technology, and specifically for the reading. And then for the ebook, let's say ebook virtues, you know, we then highlight easier to get, cheaper to own, more convenient to carry, free of the expense. So let's just put these out over here, free of the expense, and then effortless. So that's a key word there. Effortless is a virtue without the terrible burden of carrying. So those are all of the key points there, which supports the idea that ebooks are a good thing. Okay, there's some repetition. I want to highlight repetition because there's quite a lot of repetition through this speech. Repetition is used to highlight certain points and therefore to persuade the language, to persuade the audience, sorry. Okay, let's move on to the next part of the speech and do the same thing. In the second part of the speech, we can highlight a few things here. Oops, sorry, let's go back to the proper highlighting tool. Just a second. Okay. Okay, I'm an enthusiastic reader. I see books as a doorway to other worlds. My enthusiasm extends to ebooks. Okay. Some things are great. I love being able to change buttons to the side. It's fun to look up dictionary Wikipedia. It's exciting to know that ebooks can break through the limitations. Okay, so again, let's just remember the argument is that there's some, there's some virtues to these things. So that ebooks are great. Ebooks are fun. Okay, there's excitement to break through some limitations of traditional books. Okay, and again, if we just think about enthusiastic, excitement, so, and that goes back to the first part of the speech where we also talked about enthusiasm, so there's a lot of repetition there, and also the sort of excitement. So there's quite a few points there to make. Okay, now, if we then move on to the next thing, what we see is another isolated sentence by itself. So what's there to worry about? Okay, so if we think about the change in argument to the second key argument, and then the idea that there's a tonal shift also from enthusiasm to alarm or fear or concern or worry, okay, and then the language changes. So this is sort of how authors signpost, and we can even say that it's a signpost a change, or what it is that they are making the point about. Okay, so in that sense, we can highlight some keywords here. I do wonder about the video and animated images. A child all alone is something that we highlighted before. I don't find this exciting. To me, it's disturbing. The idea of a child passively consuming. Empty and unwholesome as a packet of potato chips. Dinosaurs spring to life. They exist only as dead as dinosaurs. Okay, so let's just pick out some of these things. Okay, I do wonder. Okay, if you wonder about something, it's suggesting that there's something, not just the virtues to think about, but also some of the negatives. A child all alone is a tonal shift more to sort of concern or worry. And that's the point that Mrs. Elliot is making. She describes what it is that is the concern or the worry. It's just experiencing rather than actually reading. And then I don't find this exciting. To me, it's disturbing. So what we see here is the change from all of the enthusiasm and excitement of the first argument to the opposite. It's not exciting. It's actually disturbing. And we use the simile here to make the point. You know, this highlights or brings attention to the key point there, which supports the argument. As empty and unwholesome as a packet of potato chips. You know, there's a reference to, you know, diet. It's just something that we can perhaps allude to. You know, the diet, the obesity problem is another key problem in society. So we're drawing a parallel there between two social problems. And then if we think about dinosaurs here, and later on in the speech we'll see there's another reference to dinosaurs. So dinosaurs here is, again, repetition to bring attention to a certain point. And dinosaurs, we're making the point, of extinction. So Mrs. Eliot is making the sort of metaphor of traditional books are going to become as extinct as the dinosaurs. Okay, let's carry on with the rest of the presentation. Okay, if we think about the visual, which is the slide, what we see here is the contrast. Is a boy looking at his tablet or Kindle, leaning up against a stack of traditional books. So, the point that Mrs. Eliot is drawing there is that, it's the comparison between traditional books versus the modern books. And, the look on the boy's face, it could mean, it could support the first argument that, there's benefits, but also, having him sit up against with his back turned to the stack of books, turning his back on traditional reading and the skills that come with traditional reading suggests that there's problems with that idea as well. So it's sort of, this visual is complementary to both argument 1 and argument 2, which we can mention in our essay. Okay, and then if we carry on, I wonder. Okay, so again, there's this I wonder is repeated. Endless exposure to screens, and then rhetorical questions. Do we really think it will be healthy for our kids to spend hours and hours using ebooks at school on top of the time they were spent watching TV and playing? And will we then think it's okay to take an ebook to bed? So if we think about the repetition there of I wonder, which was repeated up there somewhere, and then again we're supporting the second argument. There are concerns or fears or alarms to do with ebooks. Exposure to screens is the first thing, and hours and hours using ebooks or looking at screens is the second thing that we are concerned about. Will we then think it's okay? So there's two rhetorical questions here as well, and the rhetorical question is a device which authors can use to impact the audience, because if you ask a rhetorical question, the audience has to answer the question themselves, and the answer is the conclusion that you want them to draw, which is no, we don't think it's healthy to spend hours and hours. So the idea of children's health builds on the audience's alarm or fear of what ebooks may bring. Okay, so that's the end of that part of the speech. Let's move on. So if we continue with this part of the speech, one of the things I love most about reading is the magical way. So this is going back to sort of traditional reading books. Allows us to see the impossible or unreal things in our imagination, making the boring everyday world disappear completely for a while. But I was shocked to discover that some ebooks might disappear in a puff of smoke themselves. Publishers have in mind to update text every year as knowledge changes. It sounds exciting, but it means you mightn't get to keep your textbooks permanently. Unless you paid every year, they'd vanish, recalled by the publishing sovereign. You couldn't sell them at the community second-hand bookstore. And when something went out of print, how would you ever find it again? So again, another question there. No wonder there's a move by concerned book lovers to build huge warehouses to preserve bound books. They fear the loss of knowledge, history, even culture itself, as the world is flooded with ebooks that are accessible only through special software that depend on the computer servers of the World Wide Web. If global cyber disaster struck, the loss would be unthinkable. Okay, so here we are contrasting. So the positives of reading in the sort of traditional book sense and traditional books. And here we highlight the idea of it's magical, so something very positive. And then we turn it around. I was shocked to discover, and then this idea that they disappear or they vanish. Would you ever find it again? So there's these key points here that are linked together because of the nature of ebooks, and we can explain that. You couldn't sell them, so we make the point there that this is something else that you couldn't do with ebooks versus traditional books. And then this idea, therefore, if they're going to disappear or vanish, then there's a move to preserve them. And then if we come here, fear the loss of knowledge, history and culture. So there's a loss, so that is alarm, against the idea of preservation versus vanishing. And the world is flooded. Well, if you consider the imagery of flooding, it's always a disaster, and that's linked to this word here. So flooding, disaster, cyber, global cyber disaster. Okay, so there's definite fear being built into the speech here, and more on a sort of global scale as well. The loss would be unthinkable. So then we're becoming very Hollywood disaster movie in nature. Okay, so those are the key points that we can draw out from that part of the speech, which support the second argument that there's a lot to be concerned about with ebooks. Okay, let's move on. So the visual here, and we have to mention the visual, and the visual here supports the second argument. There's a sort of a reference here to the idea that the ebook is going to vanish. And I think the key point to note on this is that there's some humor, but the humor is designed to bring attention to a point, which is that it's not funny actually. So there's a sort of satirical element in this kind of cartoon. And then we move down the page. I have a fear. So here, again, the word fear. Ebooks might increase the gap between rich and poor. Knowledge and education are a form of wealth. I hope expensive, energy-hungry e-books don't become a new way of keeping some people ignorant. Okay, so there's some points that we can make here. Okay, again, there's this idea that from the second argument, we're turning concern, worry, or alarm into this idea of fear. And here, I think the third argument, so this becomes argument 3, which we identified in the second reading, is that the evidence to support that argument is that there's a gap, or there's a fear that the gap between rich and poor will become wider. Knowledge and education are two key cornerstones of society, which make a society developed or modern, and they are at risk. So the third argument that technology and specifically ebooks threaten society. So again, there's this idea, the third argument, that there's also a risk to society. And then expensive, energy hungry. So those are the drawbacks of ebooks. Don't become a new way of keeping some people ignorant. So this idea of knowledge and education versus ignorance, and how ebooks might be used to create that phenomenon. Okay, let's move on to the last part. So in the last part, let's just highlight some of the points here. The last one is an anecdote, so a Harry Potter story on a long and unpleasant flight to London. Hoping it would shorten the trip, I opened the book and it worked. The plane, my fellow passengers Earth below, instantly ceased to exist. Time itself began to fly. In London, I left the book in a red telephone box when anyone passing by who happened to want to read it. I felt a bit like Harry Potter character myself, being able to make a book disappear, make a free book appear from nowhere. By contrast, my ebooks, which arrive by the modern wizardry of the internet, just sit silently on their virtual shelf when they're finished, instead of being part of the lending and sharing that traditionally goes on between people who love books. So this idea of lending and sharing. Okay, now I'm starting to sound a bit like a dinosaur myself, aren't I? And then finally, nothing can stop the coming of ebooks, and I wouldn't want to stop it. I'll go on being an early adopter of new technology anyways, but okay, all of us who care about reading, and you young people as future leaders, we must all do what we can as this revolution rolls over us to make sure important things are not entirely swept away. Okay, so let's just bring out some points here. We can think about Harry Potter, and if we think back to the reference earlier, which was that reading is magical, and so here again there's this reference to something magical. There's this reference to something magical. Let me just get this out of the way, hang on. Okay, so magical here, wizardry, and a free book appear from nowhere. So there's all these references to how reading is magical. Time itself began to fly. So those are the references that we can use to support that argument. But the point that we're making, second or third argument, is that in contrast, ebooks just sit silently and there's none of this sort of magical element to them, and lending and sharing are not possible with ebooks. So again, this sort of negative idea of ebooks, not possible. Okay, and then this standalone sentence, okay, is a question to the audience, and again she's referring to this idea of dinosaurs. So it's like the third or fourth time she's made this reference. So, you know, do we want this magical virtues of traditional reading books to go extinct? No, we don't. And then she finishes with this, nothing can stop the coming of ebooks. I wouldn't want to. She highlights young people in the audience, the students, young people. It's their responsibility. But, okay, the people who care have to do all that we can. So again, I think this is inclusive, which is it's an appeal to action for the audience to take up the call to do something about it. A revolution is a very strong idea. You know, if you think of any kind of revolution in society or in history, it's a very impactful thing. So comparing the coming of ebooks to a revolution highlights how important or the event is, how sweeping it is. So we have to make sure, or the audience has to make sure, that the important things are not swept away within this revolution. You know, we can even think back to the idea of flooding. So flooding, revolution, you know, these are very strong analogies. Okay, and that last part again supports the main contention of the speech. So there we have identified the key meta-language evidence that supports the arguments that we identified in reading 2, and hopefully now we can put all of this into the table, which will then allow us to structure the essay that we're going to write. Okay, hope that helps. Thanks.